All right, fantastic. Well, we have an amazing panel here today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining and welcome to Philanthropy in Action. My name is Kelsey Mesher. I'm the Director of Policy and Civic Action at Seattle Foundation, and I will be your moderator for today. A few admin things before we get started. We will be doing intros and then have a wonderful panel discussion and hopefully have some time for audience questions at the end. Feel free to submit your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the toolbar in your Zoom window. It might be under More. And then if you'd like to follow along with the transcript, you can click on the transcript button at the bottom of the toolbar in your Zoom window and toggle on Show Captions, then click View Full Transcript. And I think everyone's on mute, but like I said, we're in a regular old Zoom meeting, so please stay on mute for the duration of the webinar. Okay, childcare. For parents, the matter of who cares for your children while you are away at work or school is highly personal. But the issue of childcare more broadly is one of economic and social infrastructure that impacts all of us, whether or not we have children ourselves. In addition, we know early childhood development and education have an enormous impact on outcomes later in life, everything from health to employment. At Seattle Foundation, we heard this message loud and clear from our partners and the community during our strategic planning process. And it's why expanding access to high-quality childcare is one of our key impact initiatives, along with the related issues of affordable housing and building communities that are accessible to public transportation. Seattle Foundation is privileged to support the childcare ecosystem in several ways. We make capital investments through our impact investing program. We work collectively with other early childhood funders. And of course, we make grants and partner with policy and community-based organizations who are advocating for reform and funding in Washington. Today, we are joined by 3 partners that are connected with these efforts, and I'm excited to introduce them. And feel free to give a wave. First, we have Dr. Susan Y. Lee. Dr. Lee is the Senior Director of Education at Refugee Women's Alliance, also known as REWA, a respected and in-demand childcare provider in Seattle. She also serves on numerous boards and committees, including a state-level design team, which has been developing childcare policy. Dr. Lee's recent research centers on social services and enterprise within the education sector, with a particular emphasis on investment and sustainability in early learning and youth education. She is committed to empowering women and creating a sustainable workforce for educators in communities that have been traditionally under-resourced. In 2024, Dr. Lee was recognized with the Population Health and Systems Leader Preceptor of the Year Award from the University of Washington, as well as the Most Distinguished Graduate Honor from Seattle University, in recognition of her influence, leadership, and impact on our community. Thank you so much for being here, Susan. Lauren Hipp. Lauren is the National Director of Early Learning and Washington State for MomsRising. She brings over a decade of experience in the early learning field, doing policy, advocacy and organizing, philanthropy, and policy and program implementation, both here in Washington and nationally. Lauren has led successful state and national campaigns rooted in the experience of moms and families. Most recently, she co-led a project to bring over 40 moms from across the country to DC to call on Congress to prioritize families over billionaires. And last but not least, Senator Claire Wilson. Senator Wilson has represented the people of the 30th District in the Washington State Legislature since 2018. She is the chair of the Human Services Committee and is proud to serve as vice chair of the Early Learning and K-12 Committee. She is also a member of the Rules Committee, Ways and Means Committee, and holds the role of Assistant Majority Whip. Claire is also the force behind major education legislation. She sponsored Senate Bill 5395, which requires all Washington public schools to provide comprehensive sexual education. She also championed the landmark Fair Starts for Kids Act, which invested $1.1 billion to make childcare and early learning more affordable for Washington families. Before her time in the legislature, Senator Wilson spent 25 years serving as an administrator in early education and family involvement. She's taught pregnant teens and parenting teens, was a program director for the WIC program in rural Montana, and she served as an elected school board director for Federal Way Public Schools. Welcome, Senator Wilson. We have a deep bench of knowledge and expertise, and I'm really excited to get into our conversation. So to kick us off, can you please each describe your role in the ecosystem of childcare work and also describe what does childcare mean to you? And we're going to start with Susan.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I am a childcare provider and serving children from ages 0 to 5 years old, and also working with our youth programming as well. So we are located here in Seattle, Washington, in King County. And what does childcare to me? Childcare is not just a service. It is not a babysitting service, as is been a stigma. It is a lifeline for families, particularly for immigrant and low-income families and refugee households. Historically, childcare has evolved from being seen as a private family care and was issued as a public good. However, that has shifted tremendously. And so we are providing a service that is critical and very important for our community. So I'll keep it brief on that one.
Great, thanks. Lauren, why don't you go next?
So I work for MomsRising, which is a national and in Washington State grassroots organization, online and on the ground. And we know that policies work best when they're built in partnership and with the leadership of those who are closest to the pain points. Communities are best at identifying both the problems and the solutions. And so our work is really about creating those bridges and pathways, breaking down barriers so that families can speak their truth to power and exercise their leadership and expertise to help better shape systems to serve children, families, providers, and communities. And in terms of what childcare means to me, if you talk to any parent, including myself, the thing that rises to the top is making sure that our children are safe, loved, and learning in whatever setting they're in. And childcare is foundational to building community for families. And we know that it is a cornerstone of community in which we raise our children and families. And I really can't think of anything more important than that.
So for me, my role in the ecosystem is really for many, many, many years, I took families and I took myself down to Olympia to try to talk to legislators about what we needed to do to make the system different to meet the needs of families. And so for me, my role in the ecosystem now is to be the open door that says you don't need to defend, just tell me what we need to do to make the difference because we've been trying to do it for so very, very long. And I think initially, when you think a long time ago, people thought about childcare, but really they thought about them as social service programs for people who didn't know how to be a parent. For anyone else who did, had other family to care for kids. So it was not a system of need. And as I look at it now, it really is a driver for so many as we think about economic recovery and economic development. And what it means to me is really, I think Lauren and I are like straight up in agreement on the fact that it really is parent choice. It's mixed delivery. It's any kind of place or space where a parent knows that their child's health, safety, and spirit is safe within someone's care. And that regardless of who we are, where we live, or the kind of work we do, that all folks need support, for we are a very different community and a very different world than we were many years ago. So that's kind of for me why it's so important that we have this conversation, and it's inclusive of all, regardless of where you live or where you come from.
Great, thank you so much. I think many of us come to this issue as consumers. I know when I was expecting my first, the first thing people told me was get on a list. And that's sort of your first introduction into childcare as a new parent. Um, and so this brings me to ask, how did we get to our current system? Can you talk about what's working and what's not, and sort of ground us in some of the history that led us to our current state? And Senator Wilson, you've got a long history of working in this issue. I'd love to start with you.
So I'm going to be the historian of the group, and then I will let Lauren and Susan move it from there. So, in 1985, so I'm going to tell you a little story way back when uh, uh, early learning sat in the Department of Community Trade and Economic Development. And that's when our state-funded pre-K program was created, ECAP, which was mirroring the federally funded Head Start program, which was a comprehensive program to serve the needs of low-income families, and that was kind of what it was for. And then in 2006, the Department of Early Learning was created in the state of Washington, and we really were leaders in that across the nation as you think about really the first creation of a department that was solely focused in care and education. And then in 2017, Department of Children, Youth, and Families was created, which then combined not only what was happening when kids and families got in trouble through child welfare, CPS, and all that, but also, again, how is it that we look at whole kids and whole families? So DCYF was then created. And in between that time, in 2011, we did the Early Start Act. And the Early Start Act was the work that really was focused on our quality rating improvement system, early achievers. And that's really looking at quality. And many states made a decision to look at access first and then quality. And what we know is it's hard to shut doors after you've opened them for folks. And so as a state, we made a very conscious decision to focus on quality first through the Early Start Act. And that was 2011. And then in 2021 was the Fair Start for Kids Act. And that's what you heard Kelsey talk about. And that was focused on access and affordability. And as a state, we made a $1.2 billion investment, but that's also caused a lot of what our challenge is right now and was in this last session, and people wonder why. This idea that early care and education, childcare is not an institution. When you think of education and you think of government, you think of institutions. They're brick and mortar buildings, and you can sit in them and say, come, and people do. Or if they don't, then you say, well, we offered it, and they didn't show up. Early care education, childcare, they're informal systems that exist in local communities that meet the needs of the families there. And they look very different based on where they are, but there are pillars of quality that you'll see in every one of those settings. But what they don't have is the infrastructure and the back office support that institutions have. And we've never really looked at childcare as a small business. We've looked at it as far as the service and support it provides to families, but we now also understand how critical it is to consider the small business side of care, which was never created that way. It was created because, unfortunately, women know and knew that caring for kids was one of the most important things that we could do. And especially as we look at our communities of color, immigrant refugee women tend to be the ones impacted the most. So that's kind of how things started, but it was never started as a business that took care of widgets. And if it took care of widgets, we would have figured out the funding, we would have figured out everything else. But we're talking about children, and we're talking about the cost that is hard to put a pin into, actually, what the true cost it is. So I'll stop there and let my colleagues take over.
That's such a perfect segue. I mean, I think not categorizing it as widgets because they're not, but also our propensity to see childcare as a private market good, which is why we are in this mess, right? the care and keeping of children is a public good. It serves us all, whether or not we have young children. It impacts each and every one of us on this call and each and every person that you're going to come into contact with. But we treat it as a private good. And so we have this uneven impact across communities. If we just ground ourselves in some Washington state childcare facts, like more than 63% of children have all available parents in the workforce. So that right there tells you like there's a huge demand for childcare. But we also know that 500,000 children in Washington do not have access to childcare for various reasons, largely because of our lack of funding. 20% of parents report having to turn down a job because of lack of childcare. Families can't afford to pay anymore, and providers can't afford to be paid any less. We know that 17% of our early care workforce lives in poverty. We're not able to pay them the wages that they need and deserve to sustain their own families and to be able to thrive. And we have historically relied on a federal partnership to provide the necessary funds to help our state manage through this crisis, and hopefully on the horizon be able to wholly address the childcare crisis and create a much better system that suits children and families and providers. But we are headed into really extremely uncertain and painful times in our national history. There are serious threats at the federal level, not to be the wet blanket here, but there is a concerted effort to sabotage systems, and childcare and early childhood writ large is not immune to that. There is a very specific plan to sabotage our childcare system with the illegal mass firings and the federal freeze of funding and untimely payments directly to providers that are creating chaos and destabilizing our system. And that's very much on purpose. So we're headed into very different territory than the present, and a whole different set of threats to the childcare crisis that was already putting families and providers in jeopardy. But this is a very different ballgame that we are in. And they are threatening and decommissioning things that allowed providers and families to know that children were safe, loved, and learning, and to ensure that our workforce is well compensated and respected. So we have a lot of things that we need to contend with right now that are coming down nationally and going to impact our state. But it's hard to know exactly how those chips are going to fall and the choices that we'll have to make as a state in response.
And I want to piggyback off of Lauren and Senator Wilson, because as a child care provider, this is directly impacting our organization and the hundreds of early learning centers and home child care centers as well. Just last week, I got an email from the Department of Education and Early Learning that ECAP has been cut. So over 700 slots have been cut from the Department of Education and Early Learning, and that goes trickle down to us as well. And I want to share, we have over 400 families on my wait list right now. So you can imagine the devastation and the impact this has directly on those families that are trying to find a job, but they can't work because they have to take care of their child. And they can't work also because there's not enough childcare. There's a lack of access. And as I mentioned earlier, childcare is not a babysitting service. It is a professional education where we are providing the supports for cognitive, social, and emotional learning for children, especially coming out of COVID. I can share with you, we have had a 75% increase of children with developmental delays, cognitively, speech, as well as social and emotional and behavioral challenges. So childcare is not just a place where people just drop their child off. It is early intervention. It is preventing children from being stigmatized. It is also allowing our parents to be able to provide services and to also stop the cycle of poverty, as a matter of fact. So there is a lot more demand, as Senator Wilson had mentioned, in terms of educational requirements for educators, teachers. So we're moving away from being called teacher. These are teachers and educators that have AA degrees in early childhood education, master's degrees and doctorate degrees as well. So I want to emphasize how tremendously negatively impactful this is when we have the government that is cutting funding and access to early learning.
Thank you all. We've already touched on so many issues that I want to get into. I wanted to point out we were having some chat malfunctions earlier, but the chat is up and working. So if you do have questions as we're going along, please feel free to drop them in the chat or to use the Q&A function of Zoom. We're going to get into some of the issues we need to address, but I wanted to dive a little bit deeper on why is childcare a racial equity issue? And if you could kick that off for us, Susan, that'd be fantastic.
Absolutely. I did a paper on this, my doctoral paper, and I will share that it's very interesting because the majority of the people that are working in childcare are women. The majority of people working are BIPOC women, as a matter of fact. So, you know, providers are typically women of color, immigrants themselves, and yet they're often underpaid and overworked and limited pathways to advancement. We need to uplift this workforce, and not only with fair compensation, but with opportunities to support their professional development and leadership opportunities. Equity. What does equity mean to all of us, especially to early learning centers? It means that we are ensuring both the families are having access to receiving the care and that the educators are feeling empowered and not being taken advantage. And that's exactly what's happening right now, unfortunately, because there's not enough recognition for all of the long hours that they are working. A lot of the educators are actually working second jobs to make ends meet. They don't even qualify for some of the insurances because there isn't any. There is not a retirement fund. And they're not able to afford their own childcare because they don't have the wages to be able to compensate for that. So unfortunately, it is a cycle that has perpetuated for many, many years. And I hope that with more advocacy, more knowledge, and more people on board and understanding the value and the impact of education, especially in an early setting, that there will be a breaking of that cycle.
Yeah, along that vein, I always, it's always important to keep in mind that the roots of the American childcare system and what we're seeing in terms of how we value and compensate providers now, that's rooted in the enslavement of Black people and then the subsequent racist laws and practices that were put into place that really relegated caregiving to its current position in society, both socially and economically. So it is, incumbent upon us as we build this new vision for childcare that we have the opportunity and, quite frankly, the responsibility to advance racial justice because we know the roots of our entire childcare system. And childcare simultaneously is about economic opportunity for families and for providers. And it's also about the care and keeping of the culture for our children. That's supporting their sense of identity and belonging, home language. And those two things together are huge racial justice issues and huge opportunities to invest in a future that allows all of us to thrive. And childcare is the work that makes all other work possible. For families that depend on a working parent or parents' income, childcare is what makes it possible for their families to survive and hopefully thrive. But we know that poverty is racialized in our country. So when we underinvest in childcare, we are compounding the economic distress that families of color experience. And we know that high quality early learning is highly associated with positive brain development as well as lifelong academic and career success, all things that children should have access to and be supported in, whether that's at home or in childcare. So when children of color are not provided with these opportunities in a level playing field, we're continuing to racialize our education and career systems in really inequitable ways. So it's why the important work that Susan and Senator Wilson are advancing is so critical to a future that is big enough and bright enough for all of us.
Yeah, there's brilliance before me there. I would also just say about money, and it's a racial equity issue in many ways. Everything we're talking about is discretionary when we talk about the dollars. So when we think about the state, for me, every bit of work I do, whether it's around food, shelter, and clothing, whether it's around child welfare, juvenile justice, DDID, whether it's around childcare, all of those things are discretionary dollars. So when we're in tight budget times, those with the least amount of voice and the least generational wealth continue to be disproportionately impacted. And those continue to be communities of color, individuals of color, and in this particular case, as you heard from Susan, in particular women. And when we look at COVID, we had our last 2008 was the recession where we really did an austerity budget where we lost every bit of support, every safety net. We never brought that back up. And then you add the pandemic on top of that and schools shut down. And isn't it interesting? People suddenly realized the role that childcare played and the role that schools played in childcare. Because we haven't even talked about school age care in particular. And I want to make sure as we think about the concept of childcare, we're also thinking about before and after school care. We're thinking about expanded learning. We're thinking about those times when, again, we've got older children who still need to have someone else's eyes, ears, and arms wrapped around them to make sure they're safe, or we will then pay for it later in my juvenile justice system, which is also discretionary. So the first things to go away, and when you think about disparate and disproportionate impacts, it continues with the very same vulnerable groups and vulnerable individuals. And so, and those impacted the most by employment, economics, and childcare, women, past and post pandemic. So we've not seen a recovery there either.
Kelsey, can I interrupt 1 second? I want to also emphasize that when we're talking about wages, compensation, just think about the teachers that are working to provide that foundation for our future. And unfortunately, because they are underpaid, when you compare the teachers that have an AA degree, BA degree in education, they're being paid lower or less than someone working at Dick's Burger. That is inequitable. That is just wrong. When there is not any insurance or retirement funds, but other organizations, working at McDonald's, for example, pays even more, or working at a restaurant. So think about that. Think about the investment that goes in and that's not going in right now, which is in our future and our kiddos.
Can I just add one other thing? And that is, I just a national statistic that nearly half of childcare workers are on public assistance or in public assistance programs.
Thank you. They're tough statistics to hear. And I mean, hearing some of the issues as you raise them, it really sometimes feel like this, it's like a bit of a Gordian knot, like everything is connected and none of it is working quite right. And so, I want to turn into what are like kind of getting more into the primary issues that we need to address and in order to make childcare more accessible and affordable for families. And if you could also speak a little bit to kind of the sequencing of how to, what comes first or how do you work on all of these kind of related, interconnected challenges at the same time. Lauren, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I think like we've discussed, childcare is a broken market primarily because it is a public good. And the greatest lever that we have is to be able to work on the funding challenge in the childcare space, both thinking about that federally and thinking about that at the state and local level and ensuring that we have a full range of and a big tent of advocates, families and providers and small businesses and you name it, out there ready to take on that challenge and to be able to speak about what are the values at our state, at our local, at our federal level to continue to push for investment. I think that there's also a really big need for narrative change work, and that sounds very like fluffy and silly, but it is core to what is our belief system as a state and as a country about what care is, why care matters, and why the child care industry is so critical and vital to building strong communities. And what does that provide for children and families? So I think between advocacy and really thinking about how do we talk about this, how do we advance these conversations at the very local level about why childcare is important, is going to serve us well in being able to advance the funding piece. I don't see anything changing until we address funding, which would then enable us to really get out we talk about the three-legged stool of access, affordability, and quality, and we have not been able to crack the nut on compensation. And if we do not address that, we're not going to be able to ensure that families have access to affordable, high-quality childcare, and that is predicated on a good amount of public funding and belief in our childcare workforce.
So I'm trying to crack that nut. So within Fair Start for Kids, we had a work around true cost of quality and had a co-design group that came up with a report that just came out in January 2025 around the true cost of quality, which is something we have to put our fingers on when we're trying to figure out pay and we're trying to figure out subsidies and all those things for families. And also, we had something called the Workforce Standards Board, and that was a bill that was going through labor, and really thinking about how you professionalize. And I mean that in a way when we think about salary, we think about benefits, we think about retirement. Not that I don't see childcare, early care, and education as a profession and those in it not professionals, but we've never in other organizations, in other worlds, in other professions where you have certifications and where you have accreditations and credentialing, you also have workforce standards that that then kind of cause one to say this is a level of pay that we look at. And when we know that half of individuals working in this space are also on public assistance, that makes no sense to me at all. So within Fair Start, those two bills we were trying to move forward. And again, when we're in the budget space we were in, unable to get those bills moved forward, but they will come back. And I would say why the stories, and Lauren, as you talk about that, why it's so important to continue the conversations in community about the who and the what and the why. So as we think about funding and we think about those other things, people understand the what and why we're talking about that. I would also say we did another cap gains. I did a bill that expanded capital gains because that's how we have tried to fund early care and education and childcare in our state. And what we saw was that's how we funded Fair Start for Kids, but we also saw a delta in what we originally thought we would collect versus what we collected the second time around, which caused some of our issues. So we have clearly have to come up with not only a funding scheme, but a source and one that is you can count on, and individuals can come into the field knowing that they're not coming into a profession that will put them in the poverty line. It's a profession where they can thrive and help families across our state.
I want to remind everybody, childcare and the teachers that are working in childcare are unspoken heroes, unsung heroes. And I hate going back to COVID, but as you may all recall, childcare was one of those that were considered essential workforce because it is essential. And the critical elements that we need to really address is to improve the access and the quality. So I'm going to come in, put my teacher hat on, put my provider hat on, and really speak and advocate for those teachers that are working long, long, long hours, 7:30 till 8 o'clock at night, and especially for those that are working in Eastern Washington family home child care centers that are working in non-traditional hours, taking care of those babies at 3 o'clock in the morning while their parents are out working in the fields. Those are the unsung heroes. And taking care of babies that are developmentally delayed and unable to speak for themselves. Childcare is amongst the lowest paid professionals, and they are performing the most complex and essential work. And this contributes, unfortunately, to high turnover and burnout because they are working in such complex and high stress levels. So when COVID was happening, they were working regardless of their own safety, and they were bringing that risk back to their own home as well. Again, these are heroes that we should not forget. And the second thing I want to talk about is it is a business, but it is also a very high level business where licensing regulations are required because there is health and safety. It is so complex in terms of what the child care center needs to do. Therefore, overhead, professional development, certifications that the teachers have to go through, and and various requirements, first aid, CPR, all of that, in addition to providing care in multiple languages, for example, and with crying babies that you have to change diapers. It is a lot of work. Just imagine yourself taking care of a baby for 12 hours nonstop, six babies, as a matter of fact, in a center crying. And, unfortunately, the challenge with a lot of the funding cuts is that families cannot afford the care any longer. So they're having to make that decision to either not work and stay home and take care of the babies, or go to work and put their child at a very risky place that is not that is not certified or cared for.
Thank you, Susan. Um, Before we move on to the next question, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your work on the design team. What was the design team and what issues were you trying to tackle? And this is just a little bit of the kind of behind the scenes for people to see. Not only are our childcare providers caring for children and directing programs, but they are sitting on tables, developing policy, fighting to make the system better. And I know you've been a big part of that.
Thank you, Kelsey. I am very proud and honored to be able to be a part of this design team. It's been about 4 years now, I believe. And so we meet after long hours, after work, on a monthly basis. And our focus really is to provide voices that are not heard. So we talk about compensation. We talk about what the needs are in our centers, in family child care centers. And we talk about the various challenges that our suburban counterparts might have, and the inequitable salary adjustments, for example, in King County versus in Spokane. What's really amazing about this design team is that it is a collective of voices from various childcare centers throughout Washington State. And we talk about professional development. How can we make that happen? And we talk about, advocacy tremendously. How do we get our message across to the community that this is important, that, we are trying, childcare is at a crisis right now. We need to address it. And so what we're trying to do is prevent that pipeline from stopping essentially. We're trying to build a pipeline for future educators, for families to have access to childcare, early learning. And we're working with Childcare Aware and DCYF to address the disparity of children with developmental delays, and also ratio. So we talk about a lot of things. And what's really amazing is that everybody has similar challenges, but no one child care center or family child care center is the same. It's because we work with such diverse communities, such diverse needs. As I mentioned, we have families working in the fields, and they need care from 1 o'clock in the morning, perhaps, until 4 o'clock in the morning. And so I just can't emphasize enough how much work is involved and how much heart and soul the teachers provide on every single day, every hour, every minute. And so I'm privileged to be part of that and working with Lauren and Senator Wilson to bring that awareness to the community.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your work. I want to turn towards the future. The problems are not small, but it would be great to hear from you all about what's on the horizon? What's next? What do we need to do together? And how can people who are invested in improving the system support you in your work?
Am I jumping in first? I think I'm jumping in first. So, what I would say is we have a focus here in our state. We have focus in the local communities. We have focus in a neighborhood level. At every level, I think this is an issue of concern. And I will also say it is not solely Washington's issue, that nationally, as you heard from Lauren, there's our issues all over. And I wanted to just share, I just got back from Albuquerque, and I'm a member of a group of 18 legislators that were pulled together by the National Council of State Legislators, trying to talk about what it is and how it is we're looking at childcare and early care and education at a legislative level and a national level, given our current the landscape. And will say for the last couple of years had been invited to the White House to talk about the next iterations, and those invitations, unfortunately, are no longer. And so the group, however, and as an individual, know this continues to be an important conversation. So was invited to come with other 17 other legislators who have this as their body of work in their state legislators, and really thinking about policy levers and kind of what we need to look at nationally, but also as a state. So things like, leave policies, labor policies, direct subsidies, things like tax incentives and tax breaks for individuals who support infrastructure and facilities, and really funding again for so many is an overarching issue on how it is we come up with some kind of a funding formula that allows us to pay the way we need to pay, but also understands that families will never be able to cover the burden of the true cost, that it's got to be a partnership. And business plays a role, community plays a role, we all play a role, and it has to be that we're also part of that solution. And then just the issues, and many of them, we, again, as a state, we've tackled, but we're 2 steps back right now before we can take more steps forward. And that's, we've talked about access, we've talked about affordability, workforce. For me, workforce stability and also pay right now is we cannot do anything until we tackle that. Quality is an issue that will continue, and we can't let go of quality to honor pay. We cannot let go of quality to honor pay. And that means that we've got to do both. That is so critically important when we think about safety and health and caring for small children. And then really the whole issue of business of childcare, and then governance, and who governs, and what do we govern, and what does that look like. And so again, wanting to have the support of an institution, but not necessarily operating like an institution, because then I don't think we meet the needs of families. So how is it that we create the infrastructure, back office support, and the salary structure and pay that individuals need for this profession, and create and maintain the flexibility and the quality that we know exists across our state, meeting the needs of families? That's what I'm working on.
I'll follow up on that. I think, in many countries, childcare and education are highly valued. Teacher roles are very well respected, highly respected and regarded. I think we need to have a cultural shift of that to really recognize and honor the teachers that are working, because they are teachers. And along with that, really is to addressing the wage issue, the low wages that are part of early learning, unfortunately. And making the policies. We are all here as allies right now. And I want to give a big shout out, Kelsey, to the Seattle Foundation, because Rewa has been a recipient, and we've been able to continue to provide childcare because since 2000, we have been proud recipients of your foundation and supporting our early learners to be able to have access to that, especially during the height of COVID. We could not have continued to provide care without individual donors and foundations. And unfortunately, during COVID, a lot of childcare centers had closed. And that is a definite shame, because it just has never recovered from that. And so I think we really need to become allies and continue to speak up in board meetings, continue to have city council meetings and the legislatures. You know, we've got a huge advocate here with Senator Wilson and Senator Murray as well. So we need to continue to fight for the voices, fight for those unsung heroes and the moms. You know, I currently have 217 families in our childcare that are low income, ECAP families. And the cut of over 700 is going to impact them tremendously. So we need to be able to speak up for those families that are unable to speak up for themselves due to language barriers, due to lack of internet or lack of accessibility. So I think that's where I really want to highlight that, you know, voices are powerful and we can make a difference. I think that's where the shift is going to start to come from.
And I'll jump in with a shameless plug for advocacy, both because I think it supports the important work that Susan and her fellow early childhood educators provide, and it backs up our leaders, like Senator Wilson and Senator Murray, of course, at the federal level. I'm going to take this in two parts in terms of thinking about advocacy. One is federal and one is state. And I'll start with federal, not because I think it's more important, but because it presents a different set of threats. We have a battle ahead of us with what is happening at the federal level. And I think it is important for us to keep our eye to the horizon, both when we're thinking about our state vision and our vision for ourselves as a country and what type of state and country we want to be in terms of childcare. We have to keep our eye to the horizon and think about what is that big, beautiful, I hate that word now, amazing, inclusive vision for childcare. At the same time, being ready for what is happening in terms of how childcare is being positioned as a wedge issue. It is in a cultural war and being used to push a proto-natalist agenda that is anti-woman and anti-family and anti-child. And we cannot allow childcare to be co-opted to increase harm in other systems, to decrease trust in public systems that we know provide important services to children and families and communities. Can they be better? Absolutely. But the way that we're going about it and the reasoning behind it is not about better serving families. We need to recapture that and talk about what is the reason and the being for childcare, right? This is an important factor in building community for families, and it is a great place for families to be able to start a strong foundation to allow themselves and their children to thrive in school and in life and all the things. So that is happening. We also know that this administration requires a lot of constant public monitoring and accountability. That takes a lot of work on behalf of children and families and providers. They are more than often the canary in the coal mine and the first alarm bell, and we need to be connected on the ground to be able to say, this is happening, it's real, and we need to address it immediately. We saw that with Head Start, we're seeing that with childcare, and that takes an incredible amount of infrastructure to be able to have that and type of monitoring system that we haven't had to have in the past. The second is state. We have incredible leadership in the state. Thank you, Senator Wilson, for your work. We have made massive improvements and investments in childcare. Washington is a leader in that. And in order not to backslide, we need to be seriously thinking about what are our progressive revenue options and how do we get there? We saw the type of budget that our governor put into place, and I think this is a time for us to think about what are our pathways to achieving the type of progressive revenue that is going to allow us to continue to fund early care and education and manage ourselves through what is coming in terms of a federal funding crisis. All of that is dependent upon having a strong grassroots capability to be able to back up what is happening in the legislature, what is happening at the ballot, and to ensure that families and providers are central to helping solve the childcare crisis. So thank you so much for your investment in early care and education, whether that is in the direct service side of the house or in advocacy. It is more important than ever because of the context that we find ourselves in. And the more investment and multi-year investment that we see, the stronger we can be, and the more coordinated and strategic we can be in the ways that we fight forward.
Thank you. Oh, Susan.
Yes, I wanted to also add on there that there is a lot of work that is behind the scenes right now. You've heard from Lauren, you've heard from our legislatures and our senators. There is a lot of community support behind early learning. We have North Seattle College that is providing the ability for our providers to have access for professional development and matriculation from, from no degrees to master's degrees early childhood education. We have scholarships that are available through our partnerships with Childcare Aware. DCYF is on board. City of Seattle's Department of Education and Early Learning and SPP programming. So there is a lot of momentum there. There's a lot of heart, there's a lot of drive, and there's a lot of passion, as you can probably hear from me. I'm kind of curving it a little bit. But what I'm trying to say is that if we can all get on board and appreciate and value the importance of early learning, we can make a change. We can make our voices heard. We can provide quality and high quality and equity to our families that are underserved, under-resourced, and those children in particular really need all of us. They need us to be advocating for them.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move us into a few audience questions. We have just a couple of minutes left. Okay, one person would like us to get really clear on priorities. They say, in my previous life, we relied on the 80-20 rule. Of the 10 issues, which 2 should we focus on first? And so let's just do a rapid round. You have to pick 2 issues for us to tackle first. What would they be? Let's go. Lauren, Senator Wilson, and Susan.
Progressive revenue compensation.
Compensation and workforce stability.
Compensation and accessibility.
Thank you. Our next question is about the role, if any, of large employers. I'm curious, what do you think about the role of employers? They are often the front lines of providing other benefits or helping to pay for them. What would that look like in the childcare space?
I think there's a role for business. What I want to make sure of, business doesn't get into the business of childcare. And I say that because it sounds great when you have lots of pregnant people in your workplace, but you have to remember that children grow older and they do not stay infants and toddlers. And I think also when infants and toddlers are infants and toddlers, parents often want them close to their employment or close to their place of work. But as their children grow older, what we know is they like them more in their community and in their neighborhood. So they'll know who their friends are and where they go to, close to where they go to school, if that's a possibility. So I think business plays a role because in order to have an employer or employee come to work and be able to focus 100% on the work at hand, it is important that employers know that those employees' children are safe. And I think what happens is employees are afraid to share, especially if they're having challenges, because they're fearful of the impact that may have on their own employment. So you don't see, like in EAP programs, employment assistance programs, very rarely did you even see childcare listed as an issue that one could bring forward and think that anybody would help you on. So I think there's ways to do it. Stipends could be available just as they pay for education. For employees, a business could pay a stipend to help cover the cost of care. There are ways of getting business engaged, but I just want to be really careful that businesses don't get into the business of childcare. As we well know, Susan's shaking her head, it is not a money-making proposition, and you just don't throw a bunch of kids in a room with an adult who has a heart that beats and think that that's going to be quality.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback off of that is you really shouldn't have to win the boss lottery in order to have access to affordable childcare in the same way that we think of paid family leave or other critical benefits for families. This is about building a system, and businesses can and should be part of figuring out what that solution is and how they contribute to that because they also benefit from a functioning childcare system. But it shouldn't be employer dependent, right? And we also have like 50% of people are employed by small businesses in Washington State. Like having putting that burden on a small business is not very realistic. And so you shouldn't have to rely on what type of employer you work for to have access to childcare.
Thank you. I think we'll probably close out with this one last question, which is, can you talk about what we know about public support for childcare? I mean, it sounds like there's some political manipulation around the issue going on, but just like regular people, do we know how people care about this issue? Lauren, did you want to
Sure.
take
Yeah,
this one?
we did a poll very recently, and it polls very well. We know that a large majority, 70% across party lines in Washington State, support a proposal that would cap costs, provide childcare workers with a living wage, and create training opportunities for providers. And a majority of voters, 62%, say that candidates voicing support for this proposal would make them more likely to vote for them. So voters are aligned and very clear about what they are expecting both from our leadership and from the types of policy outcomes. And 87% of Washington voters consider childcare a top priority for them.
Senator
I would say
Wilson.
it boils down to the money. And what I continue to say, especially on the floor of the Senate and committee, is, who are our families and how have we changed over the years? And who we were is not who we are now. And unless and until we figure out issues related to generational wealth and a deeper understanding about how we got to where we're at right now, we're not going to provide those solutions. And the best return on investment continues to be at that end in caring for families. And I guess for me, I also think about the fact I do juvenile justice and corrections and continue to talk about what's a better investment for our communities, for public safety, for families, for business, for our economy. And that is healthy and safe communities. And that starts with, again, making sure that all of our children are safe within someone's care. And that might be family, friends, and neighbors. It might be kith and kin. But everyone needs to have some kind of support. And we have got to help people understand who we are as communities, not who we used to be. And that's why stories, I think, are so, so important, and why support like, the work that folks do is so important. So people understand not just their own reality, but the reality of so many others across the state whose story and whose life experience is different than theirs.
Thank you so much. I know we could keep talking for many hours about this issue. Again, so much gratitude for all of the hard work that you are doing out in the world to make things better for families and workers. Thank you for bringing your expertise to this virtual meeting space. And I look forward to connecting with audience members in ways that you want to get engaged at future events or directly. Please take care, everyone. When you exit the Zoom, you'll get a feedback form. We would love to hear from you. But thank you again, everyone. Take care.